definitions about these criteria of design. So there are actually several that have been proposed. The most common one is this notion of specified complexity, which is advanced by William Dembski, and this is the one that gets talked about the most. Personally, I think it's the most promising as well, and I would talk about this a bit more further down the line. Another one is what we call marks of counterflow, which is by a philosopher called Del Rach. He basically argues that intelligence often leaves these sort of marks behind, what he calls counterflow marks, kind of sort of signals, marks that go against natural processes. And then another one is a kind of Bayesian inference, and this is advanced by Tim and Lydia McGrew, again, two philosophers, which they call a realistic Bayesian model, which they propose as the best way to sort of rationally reconstruct our design inferences. So there's an interesting paper that they wrote expanding on this, which is called Towards a Rational Reconstruction of Design Inferences. It's quite a lengthy paper, but it's worth reading. It does kind of go against the notion of specified complexity that they kind of argue contrary to Dembski a little bit, but I actually think they're not quite so far apart and they can complement each other. Another ID proponent is from the UK is Jonathan McClatchy. He also kind of frames ID in a Bayesian way as well. Have you come across this idea of Bayesian inference, Rebekah?
No, I feel like this is one, like I hear Bayes or Bayesian a lot, but I have no idea what that means. I don't sit around and read philosophy, so
it's kind of bringing this idea of probability and a priori evidence and posteriori evidence and things like that. So it's kind of like priming our expectations, what we would discover were we to assume that design is true. So yeah, but it gets into a very complex area, maybe for another time. Okay, so those are a couple of the methods. So we only really need one of those to work, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about specified complexity. Dembski writes that given an event, object, or structure, to convince ourselves that it's designed, we need to show that it's improbably, i.e. complex, and suitably patterned, i.e. specified. So just going back to these pictures that we saw earlier on, this face, you would call this, you'd certainly say that this is a kind of complex object. It's just as improbable as any other configuration of these rock formations. But it doesn't quite closely enough resemble the detail of a proper human face, a kind of recognizable human face. So to contrast that with the Mount Rushmore example, this is also complex, but the important thing is that it's also specified, and that it's specified in the sense that it matches an independently given pattern. So it matches these faces of the American presidents. Again, this is a big area. Dembski's written, he wrote the Design Inference back in the 90s, which is a whole book on this issue, and he's done subsequent work on that, like in No Free Lunch, and I think what his last book was, Being as Communion was his last book, which is, it's kind of in a trilogy, and it's interesting to kind of follow his train of thought and his kind of theorizing in this area. Just elaborating on this a bit, so he explains that an object, event, or structure exhibits specified complexity if it is both complex, i.e. one of the many live possibilities, and specified, i.e. it displays an independently given pattern. So, for example, a long sort of sequence of, you put your hand in a Scrabble bag and throw the pieces out. That arrangement of letters would be complex without being specified, because it's just as improbable or as complex as any other configuration of those letters. But it would just be gibberish most likely. But then he goes on to say that short sequence spelling the word "the" is specified without being complex, because it's a smaller, it's only 3 letters, but it also matches the English word "the." But a sequence corresponding to a Shakespearean sonnet is both complex and specified, because that would be, the odds of that coming out by chance would be almost impossible. The numbers would be sky high. So that's how he illustrates that, and he often uses a lot of other analogies. He goes onto things like given the size of the universe and the number of years the universe has been around, how that affects probabilities and kind of probabilistic resources. So that's a very interesting question as well to ask about how that affects our design inferences. So one more point on this one. This is again from philosopher Peter S. Williams. So he wrote an interesting paper called "The Design Inference from Specified Complexity, Defended by Scholars Outside the Intelligent Design Movement." So an interesting thing to observe is that it's agreed on by critics of ID, many critics of ID, not all of them, and also proponents of ID, that specified complexity is a pretty good marker, reliable criteria for design. And in this paper, he kind of examines different individuals. So he looks at Dawkins. Dawkins actually agrees that specified complexity is a good marker of design. Philosophers like Massimo Pigliucci, Victor Stenger, plenty of people who are normally quite hostile to intelligent design, yet the reasoning they kind of use explicitly and implicitly, when you reconstruct that reasoning, it actually turns out that it kind of follows this specified complexity notion that Dembski proposes. So that kind of gives you confidence that we're on the right track here, especially when you get lots of different people independently coming to a kind of implicit agreement on these kind of the way we reason when it comes to design detection. So I would recommend reading that paper. It's